Thanks for joining us, guys. So let me start by asking each of you, we're sitting on stage at a conference, which feels like progress. But in January of this year, with the vaccine starting to roll out in earnest, where did you honestly think we'd be in September, in the fall of 2021? What year is it? 2021.
You know, there's always this, you gotta hope for the best and expect the worst kind of feeling. I've worked on vaccines for 25 years, and frankly, in the midst of working on that vaccine, knowing how good the data was on the vaccine, I thought the public would rush to get it, that the data on safety and effectiveness and the recommendations from all the scientific experts would have people queuing up. By this point, I thought we'd have widespread high vaccination coverage, and we'd be back to living our normal lives.
Well, I'd be pleased to know I'd be sitting next to Nancy Messonnier, who I think your story embarrasses her, but it's such an important moment for our country. And so thank you from everybody. Look, in January, where we sat, this is hard to remember this, you know, only about 40% of Americans said they'd be vaccinated. We had little to no vaccine inventory in the country. Nobody could get an appointment. Alpha was roaring through, which was before Delta, and about 5,000 people a day were dying at peak. And so I think we both saw tremendous progress, and then I think we hit the wall that Nancy described, where 40% became 70%, but it turned out that last 30% made a really big difference. And for all the people that in this country that for whatever reason don't believe in science, are suspicious of authority, et cetera, you can win most things 70-30. Turns out you can't win a pandemic 70-30.
And back in January, did you think we'd be through it?
I don't think anybody anticipated Delta, and if they're saying that, then it's just par for the course with the pandemic, which is that everybody predicted everything after the fact. But not a lot of people at the time, I think, saw this coming.
Yeah.
Certainly, and I think if we would have vaccinated more people ahead of Delta, like we did with Alpha, we would probably be in much different shape. As it is, no, I think we're in worse shape than I anticipated we'd be in. I think probably most people.
The latest convoluted chapter of this saga has been booster shots, so I'm just going to run through a timeline here, a rough timeline, and correct me if I get anything wrong. Biden says in August that he wants the vaccinated general public to get boosters starting on September 20th. Immediately, you're hearing these rumblings that health officials think the administration is jumping the gun. The head of the WHO says you're giving life jackets to people who already have them while others are drowning. A couple scientists at the FDA say they don't believe there's evidence the general public needs boosters. They announced their resignations. The FDA's party line says those scientists don't represent the views of the agency. Then last week, there's a ton of action. FDA eventually says, just give these Pfizer boosters to people 65 and up and those who are at severe risk of illness, including potentially essential workers. Then last week, the CDC's advisory committee says yes to 65 plus and sure, people with severe risk, but they exclude essential workers. Then, in what I'm told is a highly unusual move, the director of the CDC, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, goes against her own advisory committee and kind of brings this back to where the president wanted it to be, people over 65, people at risk, and then essentially anyone who wants to make the argument they need it, right? Bit of a roller coaster. Do you two?
That was impressive.
Thank you. Did the Biden administration jump the gun? Did they come out too early with this announcement about September 20th?
It's a messy system, but it's actually the system I want. I want a system where we can see the dissent, where we can see people of differing opinions, where we have, let's face it, very uncertain information about a decision like this, which, as you said, has moral complexity, it has scientific complexity, we have limited amount of information. And sure, would it be great to see everybody uniformly come out and say, this is what we should do? Sure, but in a democracy like this, where we can have people dissenting, we can have people writing opinion pieces, we can have people protesting, and that's okay. And you can do that, and that's not a bad, we're used to disagreement being violent, but scientific disagreement done the right way is okay, even if it's a little bit confusing. But to parse things a little bit, just a couple of pieces you said. One is, on the global side, if we absolutely needed these vaccines across the globe, I think we would all agree that a first vaccine in someone's arm is more important than a third vaccine in someone's arm. But the truth is, we're producing 1 billion vaccines a month now. Most of the world is well ahead of the US. The biggest problem we have globally now is a last mile problem in Africa, which is about 6% vaccinated, but we're producing more than enough vaccines. What we have to do is get them from airports into people's arms. The couple 100 million to 150 million that would go into boosters in the US, fortunately wouldn't make a difference. So we don't have a zero-sum game anymore. And look, for people in the US, I think it's particularly clear that if you're over 65 or your repressed immune system or you're at risk, that a booster will be helpful to you. And it's less clear as you get younger and as you get healthier. And so, I think the argument reflected the difficulty of that judgment.
And yeah, maybe just to parse the two issues. Around the booster dose, I think the public is used to hearing scientists talk about settled science. And a lot of the disagreement that is scientific occurs behind the scenes. And what you're seeing now is that disagreement about where the science is play out in real time, and us making decisions before all the science is settled. And I think that may be the new era going forward. On this specific issue, CDC's advisory committee has has to look at the data and interpret the data, but then use the data to make a recommendation. And there is inherently in that step of analyzing the data and making a recommendation of subjectivity to it. They have to take the data and parse it through their own values and judgments and experience. If it was purely a technical argument, frankly, you wouldn't need people. You could run it through a computer algorithm and have a result. And so the reason there is an advisory committee with experts is to try to balance out the difference between where the science says and where you have to make a judgment. I think in the story that you told, the one piece that you're missing, which I think is really important, is that the ACIP, the CDC's advisory committee, wasn't unanimous. It was actually a 9-6 vote. And what that means is 9 people voted for the recommendation, but 6 people voted for language that basically is very similar to what Dr. Walensky eventually recommended. And that split you're seeing, I think, showcases the fact that the science wasn't settled and that there was a lot of judgment inherent about it.
Yeah, and then just to finish that point, have you ever been on an advisory committee before?
Absolutely not.
If anybody's been on an advisory committee before, you don't get paid to make decisions. You're not accountable if the decision goes right or wrong. So advisory committees are meant to advise. You're meant to get good, smart people to give their opinions. But at the end of the day, Dr. Walensky is the one that has to live with the decision that got made. And so she did a smart thing in saying, I'm going to consider all of your opinions, which were mixed, and what I heard from the FDA, and I'm going to make the call. And she's the one that's got to live with it. She made the right decision. But going against, quote unquote, an advisory committee, I think is something that is not something we should be frowned upon. It's something that we should look at, and as long as people explain their decisions, we should feel very good about.
That seems well and good, but I guess I still want to know, could the Biden administration have handled it better? Could they have not come out and said, we're hoping to do this thing by September 20th, and then have to take that back? Could they have been a little clearer in the rollout of boosters?
Well, look, I mean, having been one of the people in charge of communication in the Biden administration when I was there, I can tell you that every single thing you say needs to be thought through, and you need to understand how people are going to interpret it, and you need to understand that is absolutely going to happen. So when President Biden said, I want to get this out the week of the 20th, and then he came back and said, subject, of course, to FDA approval, I'm sure he would have in his mind, he would have liked to emphasize that more the first time he said it and said, look, this is the FDA's decision.
Or maybe not thrown out the date of September 20th.
Well, I think what he was doing with the date of September 20th was he had to get the government's engines in motion. He had to get the pharmaceutical chains to be ready to administer shots. He had to get so he had to do that. He had to get the country ready. He had to get boosters in place. And there's no way to do that in Washington without that being known. But yes, if he would have emphasized subject to the FDA, would it have been slightly better? Probably. I think that's a fair criticism.
I guess I would also say that there is a level of scrutiny of science that is just exponentially more than, again, I've ever experienced before in other public health emergencies. And I think sometimes our scientists or even our public health leaders don't understand how much the public and the media are scrutinizing every sentence, and how people are, and frankly, talking heads all over the country are picking out words and perhaps taking them out of context of what it was meant. I think it's a new era that we're living in, and I don't know that our scientists have completely caught up with it.
I mean, these resignations don't feel reassuring at the FDA. I feel like it can give the impression that people are afraid that, science may be following politics instead of politics following science. I have to ask you, Nancy, you recently resigned from the CDC after years in the organization. Was that because of politics?
Yeah, I think, I spent 25 years at the CDC, and I'm really proud of the time I spent there, proud of what I accomplished, and frankly, proud to work with a team of incredibly talented and committed scientists. 18 months throwing yourself at a pandemic is a long time. And it's not surprising, I think, that I and many of my colleagues at CDC and FDA, and frankly, at health departments and at hospitals throughout the country, are exhausted. And like everybody else, I think you think about where you are in your life and what you want to do next. I had the opportunity to work for Skoll Foundation. It's a tremendous foundation, and it's really a complement to what I've done at CDC. Skoll really focuses on championing the doers, the folks that are at the ground level, at the end of the equation, who are really doing the work, understanding globally that they're the ones that we actually need to champion in order to change the world. And I'm proud to work for that organization, just as I'm proud of my time at CDC.
Are we hearing enough from scientists in this pandemic, or are we hearing too much from politicians?
It's interesting. This sort of pundit class that Nancy's talking about is sort of emerges in a way that at times can be healthy and at times can be quite unhealthy. I think, as we know, and from not just healthcare, but from everything, there's this trap of you've got to continue to be edgy and interesting in order to get invited back. And there's not enough people that can make their bones by showing how reasonable they can be and by showing how thoughtful and cogent they can be. And that doesn't get rewarded enough. So look, I think thankfully we live in a society where anybody can speak their minds. These two colleagues at FDA disagreed with an opinion, felt strongly about it, published. They're allowed to publish. Nobody said, hey, don't publish that. Now, it turns out they didn't have all the data that their bosses had. And even then, I think, you can make the argument that bosses should have said, hey, wait a minute, look at the complete set of data before you publish. But no one suppressed it. It's out there. And I think that's good. I mean, I am encouraged by that, because if we are going to win back, the mission of this country now needs to be, we need to win back the 30% of people who just don't believe in science whatsoever. And they believe scientists are arrogant. They believe scientists never admit they're wrong. They believe that expertise has got them in trouble. And so, there's no way through that except an honest path. Tell the public the truth, have public debate when it's uncertain, when there are no clear answers. It's going to be messy. We have to accept that messiness. If we try to package it up and make it neat, it never works out. It never works out. Trying to oversell something to the public and overly package it doesn't work in this day and age. So that means there's going to be a degree of messiness. That messiness requires leadership. And I think it's the job of political leaders to say, here's a lot of noise, but here's the direction we're heading. I'm going to listen to scientists, but then we got to head this direction because these are our objectives.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that it's a mistake to think that you can completely insulate science from politics, especially public health. Public health inherently requires the buy-in of politicians to make public policy. And I think we have to accept that, and accept that the science is one part of the equation, but it's not the only part of the equation. Public health needs to understand that politicians are thinking around a broader array of issues. But I also think you touched on something else important, which is, epidemiology, which is the science behind public health, in some ways seems pretty simple. And if you look now, it's not just these pundits or scientists that are analyzing the data. The data is very publicly available. And frankly, some of the most interesting analysis is coming outside of the traditional scientific routes. I think we as a country and as scientists have to embrace that. But we also really need to figure out how to teach the public to exist in a world where information is so easily available and how to find their way through it. One way is certainly to try to curate that data so that the most reliable data comes to the top. But you can find any opinion that you want online. And if you are a disbeliever, you can find other people that believe the same way that you do. I don't think you can turn off that spigot. I think that's the era that we're in now. And the question is, inherently at our roots, how are we going to move forward as a country? How are we going to teach people to be better consumers of scientific data? And it's not just about health data or even about masks and vaccine. It's more broadly about all the data that's available.
I want to ask you more about what we should do next time, but first I want to ask one more question about boosters. Since you are a scientist, do you think we ultimately ended up in the right place on boosters?
I think we ended up in a reasonable place given where the data is. But I am worried about the global picture. You said something earlier, Andy, about nobody could have predicted Delta. And while I specifically perhaps agree with you, I would say that what scientists know is that viruses evolve. And we knew that this virus was going to evolve, and we knew that there was the potential for some of those escaped mutants to be more virulent, more transmissible, and frankly, in a more frightening way, more resistant to the vaccines that we have available. The longer that we let the rest of the globe exist without enough vaccine and the infrastructure to implement vaccination, the higher the risk is that there's going to be another strain of the virus that evolves, that escapes the vaccine, and that will then put us right back in the dangerous situation that we've been at. So I think boosters are part of the problem, but you really do need to think about the global picture, and the global picture is vaccines for everyone.
That's the number one issue right now.
Bringing this back to this country just for a moment, though, we've got some of us masked, some of us unmasked, some of us are vaccinated, some of us aren't, some of us will have boosters, some of us won't. Meanwhile, anyone here in this room could go get a booster right now from CVS if they just lie. Was this avoidable, or was this inevitable, this situation we're in right now?
Boy. Best job in the world, Monday morning quarterback, right? I mean, I can always tell you all the things that I wish we had done differently. And frankly, also all the things that I know now that I had wished I knew then. Is it messy? Yes. Was it inevitably going to be somewhat messy? Yes. Do I wish that we had done a better job as scientists of bringing the country along with us? Yes. And I think if the country was more coherently behind us, if the country trusted in its scientists, its scientific institutions, and its government, then some of this messiness wouldn't seem as disruptive as it is now.
Yeah, actually, I think the die was largely cast. The die is largely cast. We have a country where you get health care based upon your income, your zip code, and your employment status. So there's a roll of the dice for you. We have a country where if you work an hourly job versus if you work a salaried job, your life is almost completely different. And you likely only know people, if you work salaried job, who are also work salaried jobs. And if you work an hourly job, you likely only know people that work hourly jobs, let alone rural divide versus the urban divide, let alone the distrust of science. So, and then I think we have a country, and I just would be very blunt about this, that for generations, but for people serving in the military, has very little experience with sacrifice. Forget sacrifice, even inconvenience. Very little experience not having what we want when we want it every time. So when this country gets asked, be united, stop, to take a small inconvenience for the common good, as soon as people learned that the people dying were largely in prisons, in nursing homes, and on farm labor camps, in meatpacking plants, black and brown communities, a lot of people stopped paying attention. So that's not the cause or the fault of the virus. The virus is only dangerous if we make it dangerous. Virus only spreads if we breathe near one another and if we do things that allow it to spread. Just not to say that there won't be some spread, but the virus found a very comforting environment in this country and it's largely because of all these societal issues, the same issues that plague us on climate, it's the same issues that plague us on biodiversity, it's the same issues that plague us on a lot of things where we each have to do a little bit to make the world a lot better. And so far, we're probably, of all the world's democracies, we come in last in every one of those categories.
Let's talk about the next pandemic a little bit. 700,000 dead, we're approaching that number quickly. Being that this is the country we live in, what could have been done better?
What could have been done or what should be done next time?
Both, I suppose, to avoid that number.
Well,
we knew this was the country we were getting into when this thing started.
Let me give you some optimism. Let me give you some reasons for optimism for next time. The countries that performed well relative to almost every measure, the economy stayed reasonably steady. They had the fewest deaths per capita. Their healthcare systems were less constrained. They were able to continue to provide healthcare services. Had a couple of things in common. One of them doesn't describe us very well. One of them actually might in the future. The first actually has nothing to do with your wealth. It has nothing to do with your geography, your closeness to China, whether you're an island nation, none of that. It has to do with the difference between the top decile and the bottom decile income level in your country. The more commonality, the more society understands one another, the more people were willing to take steps for the common good. That doesn't describe the US. We look a lot more like Brazil, we look a lot more like Russia, we look a lot more like India than we do like, East Asia or, Central Europe or Northern Europe. But the other feature turns out to be even more important, and that is prior experience with pandemics. And look at Hong Kong, you look at Taiwan, you look at Vietnam, you look at countries that all of which are very proximate to Wuhan, very proximate to China. They have reflexive behaviors, putting on masks. Even without government intervention, there were no requirements in Hong Kong that people put on masks, but people had experience with SARS. Even in the US, in San Francisco, it's probably the place where there's the strongest muscle memory of a public health crisis from AIDS and HIV, and there is some remnants, and you can talk more about this if you want, of a public health system and people who remember managing a public health crisis. And you could see it in the way that people behaved and responded. So the things that we have to do better next time on the technical side, better stockpiles, better tests, all those other things, those are technical things that we'll get better at. But the real question,
that's a guarantee.
Sure, we'll get better at it. We won't be perfect at it, but look, we tend to be better after we learn our lesson. So we'll learn, even if we've learned that lesson, the question will be, how do we as a country, as a populace, respond? What will our memory of this pandemic be? And there's some hope, not that we'll be 100%, because this is not a country that does that, but that we will have more quick response and people with more muscle memory. That's the hope. But to do that, we need to have dialogue. We need to understand. We need to listen to doctors and nurses. We need to listen to public health people. We need to listen to small businesses that close. We need to have a real dialogue for people to really let those lessons cement.
Yeah, it's interesting. I get where you're coming from. My concern is that we have a short memory, and that I've, in my role at CDC.
You'll let me be positive.
I will get to a positive part, I promise. But, we have a short memory. We live through a crisis, and then we, I think, intentionally in some ways put that crisis down and move on with our lives, try to focus on the positives, and the energy to fix the inherent problems that cause that crisis don't drive sort of long-term investment. Now, none of those crises, I'm talking about Ebola, SARS, MERS, H1N1, influenza, anthrax, have been of the magnitude and scope of this. And so I'm hoping that we as a country will seize the moment and say, we're committed to saying never again. And never again means investment to ensure that we have the infrastructure and the people in place for public health in the United States, but also globally. I think in addition to what you're talking about that didn't work well in the US, globally, the kind of global coordination that you need in order to ensure vaccine development and production everywhere across the globe, to ensure that countries have common intelligence, have common approaches, I think that really fell apart too. And you know, the summit last week, the UN General Assembly summit, the UN General Assembly and the President Biden summit was meant to be a launching pad for a new global initiative that really brings in not just the US and governments, but philanthropy and businesses for sort of a whole of society moment to say, we need to seize the moment. We need to use this energy not only to end the current pandemic, but to ensure that we build back better, that is, build the kind of infrastructure and systems that will be more resilient for the next time.
Not to bring this back to a dark place, but let's talk about political polarization for a minute here, especially as it relates to this pandemic. I mean, 700,000 dead. President Biden likes to come out and remind us of this unimaginable amount of death, and it feels like half the country's hearing it and half the country doesn't care. Half the country still wants to fight about masks on planes and make, you know, flight attendants' lives a nightmare. How have we learned anything about how to combat political polarization in a public health crisis over the course of 2 administrations?
Yeah, I can't begin to tell you how sad it makes me. And I have talked to a few friends who are not mask wearers and aren't vaccinated. And you know, I go back to those conversations where even knowing me and trusting me, I can't convince them that those are the right things to do. I think we have to really move forward in a way that respects our differences and understands that people inherently believe differently. To me, it's about scientific literacy. People trust those that they're closest to in their own communities, who they trusted before the crisis happened. And I think we really need to understand where this is coming from. It's coming from deep distrust of our institutions and our scientists. And what it means, if it's been that long to develop, you're not going to solve it quickly, and you're certainly not going to do well trying to solve it in the midst of the crisis. So I think what it points to is the need to really invest in the development of those long-term relationships of public health officials in those communities who can be trusted, but are also really rooted in the science, and also healthcare providers in those communities that have access to the right information, and really build long-term relationships with their communities and their patients.
And this is a tech conference, so I'm contractually obliged to ask if tech can help. I mean, a lot of the disinformation is spreading on tech.
Okay, I'm gonna let you start this.
Can you combat disinformation with tech? Are we? Are we doing a good enough job? Probably.
Yeah, Facebook could do better. They know they could do better. I think others of the social media companies, I think, recognize the challenge and I think work at it. I think, unfortunately, of the people who aren't vaccinated, I think the data is 2/3 of them believe one of 5 major falsehoods about the vaccine. And most of them say they get their information from social media. And Facebook and WhatsApp are real problems. And that's just the reality. And is it addressable by them? Yes, I believe it is. And that's a long conversation. You can read the New York Times piece that showed the fight I was having with Facebook from the White House if you want.
I also think, though, there's also part of this that is not the media, but sort of more people-focused. You know, when I was a kid, if we had to do a research paper, we went to the library. And now I'm dating myself. And my teacher told me that the encyclopedia was not an appropriate reference. I had to actually look at real reference texts. And that was sort of baked in, that you actually had to figure out what the source data is. I think we need to do a better job of teaching people that Googling something or looking it up in social media is not research. Research is knowing the source of the data, knowing who you trust, and being able to sort of sort through all the misinformation to find the kernel of truth.
And I think, by the same token, scientists need to do a better job making reliable information available and accessible and reliable by people. Yeah, interpretable.
Yep.
I'm going to ask one last question about equity, and then I think there's some microphones here for people who have questions for these two. Andy, you kind of brought this up, but I mean, we're at this conference right now where, you know, there's an app, there's rapid testing, there's really clear communication, there's really clear rules. We're living currently in this little bubble in the optimal version of this pandemic, and a lot of people aren't and haven't been for over a year and a half now. Have we gotten any better at dealing with that or learned some lessons that can help us in the next pandemic?
Look, I mean, we opened our first federal facility right here in East Los Angeles, and it was mobbed on the first day by people from Beverly Hills. Probably the first time they've been in East Los Angeles in a long, long time, I would venture to say. And when we looked at the peak of deaths here in January, the western part, you know, Santa Monica, Beverly Hills, was some of the safest part of the country. And East LA was where all of the deaths were occurring. And, you know, I personally think that's the whole thing right there. That's the whole thing right there. Out of sight, out of mind. I can't say how many people have said to me, Andy, I don't know a single person that died of COVID. This was the last year, so maybe that's changed. And, you know, my response was always, you do know people dying of COVID. And they're like, no, I don't. And I'm like, well, the person who grows your food, the person who drives the truck to bring the food to the warehouse, the people in the warehouse, the people in the grocery store, you may not know their names, but those are all the people that are dying. In a different kind of society, you would know their names. But there's this sort of dissonance, this cognitive dissonance, because we live in these bubbles. My podcast is called In the Bubble. That you have a very, you can kind of carve out the life you want, whether it's information bubble, whether it's life or whatever. And that's why I think we tolerate so many things you'd think we wouldn't tolerate. If you would have told us, any of us, at the beginning of this, we wouldn't be shaking our heads and seeing 2,000 deaths a day, 3,000 deaths a day, that we would get used to it. It would be very sad. Maybe some of us would say that's possible. Maybe a lot of us would say it wouldn't, but it would be very, very sad. What it says about us, that, you know, kind of life just goes on unless we know the person. And that means we had a lot of work to do as a society to bring this stuff together, or all the questions you're asking. Politics is just a reflection of culture. It's not, politics doesn't just happen by itself. We got to go fix some of these underlying societal issues, I think.
Okay, I'll leave it there for a moment in case we have any questions from the audience. Yeah, microphones are 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you so much for coming. Tammy Franklin with Marsh McClellan. You touched on it a little bit, but I wondered if you could add some color to this too. You talked a bit about communities of color, and we talked about scientists and being able to trust the science. But if you go back, kind of, there's a historical pattern, right, of black and brown people, medical experimentation, right, where NIH, Johns Hopkins, I mean, these renowned institutions were caught kind of non-therapeutic medical experimentation on people, brown people, color, starting with slavery, then prison systems, and even to the military. So it feels a little bit like the sins of the past kind of coming home to roost, and that how can you get people to trust the information coming from the science when we've got this long, long history of the institutions that were there to protect them that failed miserably?
That's right. I'm sorry, go first. That's right. Not only that, but as you all know, and you probably even know, it continues today. I mean, you ask people of color whether they trust the medical system, whether they trust the information they get from doctors, pharmacists, they feel talked down to. They feel like the system isn't designed for them and the time they get there. It's not in neighborhoods where they live. So the distrust is maybe less explicit, thank God, but it's as strongly implicit as ever. And so when we say to people, okay, now do what we say,
right.
People are like, wait a minute, you don't care about me. So until we have culturally competent care, until we have people who are in positions of power and in medical roles that look like and sound like and come from the same communities that other folks do and have that lived experience, that's a real issue. And that got exposed.
Yeah, I totally agree. And And I think we have to own our mistakes and figure out how we're going to move forward. You know, we talk blithely about mistrust and misinformation, but you know, just like politics are local, trust is local too. And I think the drivers of distrust look really different in different communities. And the solutions perhaps are somewhat different, but inherently, it's about building back trust. And people want to talk to and hear information from people that look like them, that are from the same communities that they're from. You know, we talk about sort of this, frankly, ivory tower phenomenon of the bubbles that we live in, but, and that's true, the people that are doing the hard work down in the communities, down in the hospitals, those are the people that we need to support, because those are the ones that are going to be able to reverse these trends, making sure that they have you know, equitable jobs, that they get good salaries, that they feel confident that they're still going to be in positions, and that they can build back in those communities a sense that, that science and scientists and our institutions can be trusted. I think that's how we need to move forward.
Thank you.
One more, and then we're going to have to wrap it. Thanks.
Yes, good morning, Alain Mutrici, Sprim. I have really 2 quick questions.
Ask one of them, because we have to get off the stage.
I don't think people understand that even with vaccine, they can carry the virus, get sick and carry the virus and contaminate other people. Has the CDC any ability or mandate to do a media campaign explaining to people that they have the freedom to not have a mask, but they don't have the freedom to kill other people by giving them the virus? And the second question is, you have only 4 states in the US that have a QR code that, or system that registers the vaccination that can be used as a proof of vaccination, if I'm correct. Why is there not a system like in any other civilized country in the world? EU, they have a QR code across the whole continent and 300 million people. By the way, that can be read in China and other Asian countries. So why don't we have this in the US?
Feels like both of those questions are just about why don't we communicate better? Why doesn't the government communicate public health better?
There's a tech edge to the question, which is, you know, these QR codes, and Nancy and I were talking about this behind the scenes, and actually we have the technology here in the US, and it's going to be rolling out about a month from now. But it's not about the technology. Again, it's back to the same themes we talked about. It's about the culture and the politics of you know, we have this sort of mad obsession with this thing people think of as freedom, when in fact, you know, it's freedom that rests on the shoulders of a lot of people that did a lot of work to establish that freedom, and that freedom always came with responsibility. But so if we choose as a culture to say we as individuals are more important than the whole, that each of us, as opposed to none of us is more important than all of us, then we will not break through and use these apps. Europe's not the only one that knows how to do the app. It's not that hard. It's just they are willing to say none of us should be more important than all of us when it comes to things like our health. We as a society pretty much have decided state by state, community by community, whether or not we believe in that. And that's the reflection that we're seeing. And that's the argument that I think has to be had. But it's never been the case in the US that we've had a uniform view of that question. We've had very strong regional differences. We've had very strong philosophical differences, and that battle's not settled.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you know, I'm proud to have been born in the United States. I'm proud to be an American. And we're an unruly people. I mean, we were founded on some very specific principles that prize individual freedoms. And I think this pandemic came, unfortunately, at a time when we're grappling with how you balance out those individual freedoms with the need for societal good, and how that balance sorts looks really different in different parts of the country. And I think it really does explain some of the cultural community differences that we're seeing. This pandemic is going to end. I mean, pandemics end. But those issues won't end, and I really hope that we'll seize the moment to try to grapple with them, or we'll find ourselves in exactly the same situation again.
Dr. Nancy Messonnier, Andy Slavitt, thank you guys. Thank you.